No information, starting with Michael, if you would just let the crowd know who you are and all of that. Or do you want me to just...
No, I'm happy to. I'm Michael Rosenfeld. I'm currently Vice President of National Production for Twin Cities PBS, which is one of the major producing stations in the PBS system. Before that, I had a long career at National Geographic Television.
Boy, too late for the microphone? Would you like to repeat everything that you
all
said?
heard that, right? Oh, you did? Seriously? Do you want it? Seriously? Okay, sorry. I'm Michael Rosenfeld. I'm Vice President of National Production for Twin Cities PBS, which is one of the major producing stations in the PBS system. So what I do is executive produce films produced by the station for national broadcast on PBS. And previously, I had a long career at National Geographic Television, and I've produced in films.
I'm Ron Bachman. I'm the Senior Director of Programming at WGBH in Boston. I've been there since dinosaurs roamed the earth. And I'm responsible. I work on the local side. You may know GBH as a national production center as well. So we're kind of bifurcated, local station, national production house. I work on the local side doing television scheduling for our various channels, some program acquisition. I also work for the World Channel, which is based out of GBH, a national documentary nonfiction channel for public television. I do the national schedule for that and work with colleagues who do a lot of acquisition of films for that channel.
Is everybody able to hear?
No.
So what I think is we should get a little closer to the microphones.
Testing.
Yes, Beth, go.
Good. I'm Beth Levison, and I'm an independent producer. I'm based in New York. I have a film here this year called Made in Boise. My film that was here last year, Personal Statement, was acquired by World Channel and distributed nationally. And Michael Rosenfeld was my first boss.
You gotta love that.
I'm Eric Ford. Ooh, hi. There we go. I'm from Vermont PBS. I'm the Director of Programming. I've been there for about 3 years, and one of our focuses here in Vermont is local and regional programming. We have a series every week, so we have premieres every week, 52 plus weeks of the year. There's only 52 weeks, but we have 50 to 70 premieres of local and regional films. So we have a big focus on local as well as our national programming for PBS and other distributors.
So I had written a really elaborate introduction based on the bios they gave me, but now I don't have to read them. And we can go on to something more meaty. So just where we are. So I want to say thank you to the folks at the Middlebury Inn for staging this panel. It's the second year we've been here. It's a quite nice room. The title that you read in the program is Navigating the PBS Programming World, Producers and Acquirers Tell All. So I'm welcoming all of you and wish to say that this panel, their collective experience is enormous. And hopefully we can tap a little bit into the depth of what they have accomplished and also have some questions that I'd like to see come out of this, some answers out of some questions. So anybody who's here as a visiting filmmaker, what I'd like to see is a takeaway, sort of a clear sense of the various entities within the overarching PBS system, both at national and local level, and how they actually fund and acquire programming and how independent producers approach these entities. So for instance, WGBH, Ron's employer, is a major force in the system, both as an acquirer and distributor of programming, and as the producing home of a specific program like Frontline. How does a filmmaker get on WGBH's radar, both locally and nationally? How does a producer approach Frontline? Independent Lens and POV are important series for doc makers to gain access to. How does this happen? What does the pitch look like? When a producer like Beth signs on to a film, does she have a particular PBS program in mind as a home for the film? What distinguishes POV from Independent Lens? How does a producer become attached to a producing entity, as is the case with Michael and his leadership of national production at Twin Cities Public Television? And for a non-producing entity like Vermont PBS, how does a local brand, like the series that Eric built called Made Here, how does that get built and can it be replicated elsewhere? So I want to start with a question to Beth, though we'll not get around to all of those, believe me. This is me up one night. writing this stuff down because it's interesting to me. Having spent some time looking into the layers of PBS, a lot of things do jump out. There are seats, so fine and great. Okay. So question to Beth. One thing that you feel in writing to me that must be addressed is funding. PBS has extremely strict rules around it, and making some films, like your latest film, Made in Boise, are, according to you, difficult to fund for PBS. So can you speak to these rules and the limitations they create for you as a producer?
It might be helpful for me to talk a little bit about the genesis of a film like Made in Boise. So that was a film that was started initially by the director, and through grant writing we secured the support of the IDA Enterprise Documentary Fund. And that allowed us to really proceed with the film, and once she actually got that funding, that was a moment in 2017 when I came on board. And shortly upon the receipt of those funds, we applied for what's called ITBS Open Call. So does everyone here know what that is? Okay. ITBS Open Call, someone actually might be a little bit better equipped to describe it, but ITBS is a funding and producing entity within the public television system. Twice a year, they have something called Open Call, when all projects can submit. You have to have a sample reel of no more than 15 minutes and a full proposal, and it's open to anybody. And to make a long story short, we submitted Made in Boise to Open Call in January of 2018, and we were one of 6 projects chosen from many hundreds. Once you're in the ITBS system, you are sort of designated as a very strong potential candidate for public television, which has many different layers, which other people can talk about maybe, but there are some programs that are on the hard feed, like, is POV hard feed?
Yes.
Yeah, so POV is on the hard feed. Independent Lens has very strong national penetration, but not all programs are distributed nationally at the same time across all stations. World Channel, which I'm sure you'll talk about, is a different kind of channel. But once you get ITBS funding, you're sort of in the system, and they're watching you and thinking about where you can go. And when you agree to receive ITBS funding, you then have to sort of abide by public television guidelines if you wish to have a public television broadcast. And I'll just say there's a difference between public television and PBS. Public television is sort of the broad, the broadest sense of it. So once you're in the public television system, there can be no conflict in terms of your funding. So or public television is very committed to transparency. They're very committed to no conflict of interest. It's just an incredibly rigorous process of making sure that your funding, that there's a hard wall between your content and your funding, and that it cannot be perceived as otherwise. So I guess what I would say in the Made in Boise example, Made in Boise is a film about surrogacy in one of the places where you least expect it, Boise, Idaho. And the film is about, in some regards, an industry that took root in Boise. It's a film that's very local in its storytelling. The world of the film is Boise, but it is about something that's happening nationwide, and it is about this industry. And I guess I would just say an example is that it became very complicated to fund because we had fertility clinics, for example, in San Diego. There was a fertility doctor in San Diego who loved the film, who felt she'd never seen such a sort of just and fair treatment of surrogacy. She works with a lot of couples who pursue surrogacy to build their families, and she really wanted to support the film, and the clinic was ready to come forward with $100,000, which is, to an independent production, is a serious amount of money. And we knew that there could be an issue, but we were talking to our supervising producer at ITVS, and just very quickly it was impossible. It was partially impossible because the fertility clinic wanted their logo in the film credit. So anyone watching could deem that the film was influenced by this funder. So, that is just, and then there was a spokesperson for a national organization that promotes surrogacy. He wanted to support the film. Once again, we had a similar conflict of interest. So I feel like in other contexts, we could have secured that funding. We could have found a way to make that work. But the vetting process, what money comes in for a project that is slated for public television, the vetting process is just so rigorous that we couldn't even consider it. And this happened multiple times in different nuanced ways, and it made for funding the film very difficult.
Had you not been accepted by ITVS, then you would have been open to accepting the money from these other private sources?
Yeah, but then we would have had the challenge of where is the film going to be distributed and broadcast. So then we would have had the money to make the film, but then we wouldn't know where it would end up. And of course, people were interested in supporting the film because they knew it would have a public television broadcast. So I think it's always this balance of where do you fundraise from vis-a-vis what is the best platform for your film. And the only other wrinkle with public television is, in my experience, sometimes investors are not as incentivized to support your film because the likelihood of them seeing a return on their investment can be lower. So there are incredible benefits to public television, but I think it does sometimes pose challenges in the fundraising process.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, I think there's a really good reason that PBS is so sensitive about funding sources, and that's because PBS receives public funding and is can be often criticized for films, even the most balanced films. So the network tends to be extremely careful about conflicts of interest and perceived conflicts of interest. It can be a little frustrating, and sometimes you feel like you're threading the needle, but it does make you feel like you're operating within a system that has a great deal of can you all hear me? In a system that has a great deal of integrity, and I think that's great for both filmmakers and for the network.
Okay. I have a question for you directly, Michael, which is, you expressed in some of the notes you sent to me that you're also concerned about the funding issue. In this regard, you noted that because PBS rarely funds a program in its entirety, how then do producers raise the rest of the money to complete a film or a series? Do you want to comment on that as regards the Dictator's Playbook? Is that something, which is his most recent series, and is really good, but did this come up in terms of not being funded entirely, or am I missing the point?
Yeah, I guess there are always exceptions to the rule, but by and large, PBS will not fund a film or series in its entirety. You get a license fee or a co-production contribution that mostly covers U.S. rights. Sometimes they pick up additional rights, but then it's really up to the producer to figure out where the rest of the funding comes from. PBS can sometimes be very helpful in helping producers figure out where to get the rest of the money. But for those of us who are sort of involved on the producing side, that is a big that's a big part of what you have to do to get your film off the ground. So with Dictator's Playbook, I actually I pitched that to Beth Hoppy, who's now moved on, but at the time was head of programming at PBS. And by the way, when I mention PBS in this context, it's the network, the mothership, that controls the primetime schedule. That's a whole different question because, as you've probably already picked up, PBS is an incredibly complicated system, and it's very easy to get sort of lost within it. But I pitched the project to the commissioning editor who oversees the national primetime schedule for PBS. So, 8 o'clock to 11 o'clock in prime time. And she liked the idea, and she said, if you could raise the rest of the money, I'll give you half, which is actually a very generous offer from PBS.
Is that typical?
I was surprised that she was willing to come up with that much money, and in the end, she didn't quite come up with that much money, which is also typical. But then the puzzle was, okay, how do we raise the rest of the money? And we did it, in this case, by using a Canadian production company, which was able to bring Canadian tax credits to the table. Canada has a very progressive tax system for filmmakers. So they were able to bring a third of the budget to the table. And then we made a co-production sale to the National Geographic Channel International, and they picked up all the international rights. So between those three sources, we funded the series. That's, there are endless combinations of ways to do this. So I'll just mention a couple of other places that producers typically go for funding. One is the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which is a really important entity in Washington that has money to support public media, so radio, as well as television and digital. They can be a major source and a really important one. Then you have, the National Endowment for the Humanities, National Endowment for the Arts, individual foundations, often donors, individual donors, especially locally, like in Twin Cities, we have local donors who make a difference to our productions. Corporations are still out there, but that's become much harder to count on. Ken Burns, it has major corporate support, but by and large, corporations have backed away from the kind of funding that they used to provide. So it's a major puzzle. You're really putting the pieces together to get all the funding to fall into place. And it's part of the creative challenge, really.
I just wanted to add on to this, because you've heard from the producer's perspective here, the filmmaker's perspective, and I wanted to talk briefly from the programmer's perspective. I don't make films, I just schedule them. You heard me say earlier that I work on behalf of the World Channel, this national news documentary nonfiction channel. The way that works, very briefly, is that individual public television stations around the country sign on as essentially subscribers to the channel. And we're almost 60, about 2/3 of US TV households now. So what that means is, when I make a scheduling decision for World, I'm essentially making a scheduling decision on behalf of every market that carries World. And of course, there are different prevailing standards, editorial standards, community standards, and things like that. So I have to be really scrupulous in looking at films that I schedule. And sometimes the whole funding thing can be really almost insidious. I mean, I remember, I'm going to be deliberately vague here because I don't want to inadvertently sound like I'm dissing a perfectly fine film, but a film came across my desk a few years ago that was a historical documentary about an aid organization that helped a particular group of people in the early part of the 20th century, and it was actually very well made. It was pretty compelling, and I was getting ready to schedule it. But something encouraged me to do a little digging online. I was curious if the organization still existed. And it turns out that it does, but under another name. And it turns out, when I did a little further digging, that the guy who made the film was on the board of that organization. Now, the organization, as I understood it, didn't fund the film. That would have been a big problem. I mean, that would have just scrapped it right there for me. If a film comes across my desk that's about an organization that's funded by that organization, it's kind of a non-starter. But in this case, it was less about the actual funding structure and more about possible perception that this was a film that was essentially promoting the work of an existing organization, even if it was work that had been done decades ago. So that's just a whole other layer to give you a sense of the hurdles that one needs to, jump when getting a film on public television.
If you don't mind, Ron, I want to stay with you for a second. You raised something in your note to me about syndication.
Yeah?
So let's talk about that for a moment. For so those of you who are not aware of what this important aspect of program distribution is about, this is a brief description from American Public Television. They talk about APT syndication, seeks out and secures programming from domestic and foreign producers and sells it to interested public television stations. So this service acquires and distributes many popular genres, including dramas, comedies, documentaries, musical performances, feature film packages, etc. At a minimum of 3 national screenings each year, APT syndication offers public television stations an array of series and specials. These screenings are true markets where commitment by a station signifies its decision to purchase and broadcast a program. So Ron, so from your perch at GBH, you've amassed a lot of experience in the syndication arena. Can you tell us about the process? Is there a minimum number of stations needed to syndicate a program? And then which programs have been the biggest successes in syndication?
Okay, well, and I'm going to open it up a little bit broader than that and talk about not just APT, but to give you a sense.
I just use them as a
No, it's a
guide.
good example because, okay, I'm going to take a step back and pick up on something Beth said earlier, which is that the terms PBS and public television are not synonymous. Public television is the larger public media ecosystem or television ecosystem. PBS is a specific organization that member stations pay dues to and they get programming from, and that includes the PBS primetime schedule, the kids schedule, news hour, that sort of thing. But that programming doesn't fill a station's schedule. Stations need to go to other sources, and so they go to places like APT, American Public Television, which is based in Boston, and which after PBS is probably the biggest supplier of programs to public television stations. They actually offer 2 different mechanisms that I'm going to talk about here. The first is syndication, and that's kind of what you would expect it is. They offer multiple times a year, they come to stations with a slate of offerings, and they offer programs for sale for a license fee to stations. Those fees are based on market size. So New York is going to pay a lot more than, you know, Poughkeepsie. But in any case, I don't know if they guard that formula with their life. It's like the formula for Coke or something. You know, they won't tell you how they come up with these numbers, but that's how it's formulated by market size. And to answer your question, Lloyd, if an offer goes out, it's really less about, in syndication, it's less about the number of stations that sign on. It's about the fact that APT has determined with the supplier of the program an ideal number that the supplier would like to aggregate from a sale to stations. And if enough stations sign on to that property to aggregate that amount of money, at least at the minimum, then it goes to contract, and those stations that opted to buy it get the rights to air it. Now, they also operate a mechanism called the exchange, and this is something that is a pool of programs that stations pay an annual dues to get access to, but they're not paying a per program license fee. And more to the point, for the filmmakers in the room, the filmmaker doesn't make money. So this is a mechanism that offers exposure, but not revenue. So it's typically a lot of types of programs are distributed through exchange. A lot of cooking shows that you see on public television. Sometimes it's a project that originated at a local station for local broadcast, and they decided that it would be of wider interest, and they take it through exchange to get it out to the system. Sometimes it's a one-off, a mini-series, whatever. It's a broad range of stuff. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that there's not a license fee that comes out of that. So it's really a route to go if you're cheaply looking to get your program seen as opposed to make a lot of money off of it. In that case, there is a minimum number of stations that have to sign on to a given show in order for it to go to contract, and that number is 25, as I understand it. So if it's lower than that, I guess APT just determines that it's not worth the time and resources of their staff to distribute the show, if only, less than 25 stations are interested in running it. Most of the stuff that gets offered through the exchange does go to contract, because usually they meet that minimum. That is not always the case with syndication. I would say the majority of their syndication offers probably go to contract, but there are those that don't aggregate enough money to go to contract.
So just a quick follow-up then. So Ron, so in syndication, you would need to have the biggest markets say yes to that because they are the revenue generators. They're the ones who pay the biggest license fees. So essentially, is there a percentage of the country, you need to get a top 10, top 20 to say yes at a certain license fee for the program to become a go?
It's not that simple because there's not a single formula here. It really comes down to whatever that amount of money is that's being sought. And I mean, I've seen shows go to contract with a relatively small number of licensees, but if one or two of them are major markets and are, accounting for the bulk of that money, then it can go to contract with a small number of stations. By the same token, if a lot of stations sign on to a contract, but they're all very small stations who are paying a small amount of money, it may not be enough to aggregate whatever number they're seeking. So it's kind of depend on the program. And I know that there's sometimes a supplier has perhaps unrealistic expectations about the amount of money they're going to make, and something falls through, or else they just lower their expectations. The other thing I want to just mention is there is another organization called NETA, N-E-T-A. It stands for the National Educational Telecommunications Association, which is a mouthful, which is why people call them NETA. They are in Columbia, South Carolina. They operate almost entirely on the same model that APT's exchange does, which is to say, stations pay an annual dues to get access to those programs. All of the programs that NETA distributes there's no license fee attached to them. So again, they're chiefly offering distribution as opposed to revenue. But they are legitimate and quite active distributor.
So that's an exposure play as opposed to a revenue play for a filmmaker.
Yeah.
One quick question also as a follow-up. So back in 2007, I noticed that PBS and GBH entered into a joint distribution agreement that had much to do with what programs got syndicated. So question, does that agreement remain in effect, and what impact did it have?
Well, I assume that what you're talking about is an entity called PBSD, which means PBS distribution. It used to be that both PBS and WGBH had separate home video operations, and they combined forces instead of competing with each other. But it's kind of broadened a little bit because now PBSD will sometimes actively go out and seek the broadcast rights to something that it can then also sell in home video. But honestly, it's very rare that those kinds of properties are sort of independent films. They're sometimes, right now they're heavily involved in foreign drama series, for instance, that they've secured broadcast and streaming and probably video rights to. And they've brought in some things from Canada occasionally. But they really only want to fasten onto programs or series that they think they can monetize because it's a revenue-generating business.
Eric, I have a question for you. So in your role as Director of Programming at Vermont PBS, so you were instrumental in developing the Made Here series for the channel, which is a weekly program that you host and that features films from local and regional filmmakers. Can you talk to us about building a local programming brand and whether it could be replicated elsewhere? This has implications for licensing films, and I'd like to sort of get into that if you could.
Yeah. Sure. I think when I first started at Vermont PBS 3 years ago, it was with a charge to get more local. We really wanted to stand out in the marketplace. We wanted to show something that was different. You can get a lot of PBS programming through Netflix or Amazon Prime, different avenues. We really wanted to say, what are we telling? What's the story that we're telling about what's happening locally? And what's great about PBS and how it makes it different than other TV networks or stations is that we're consolidated, but we're also unconsolidated at the same time. Each station can kind of decide what it wants to show and doesn't want to show, especially when it comes to local. Actually, local and pledge programs can interrupt the NPS at any time with no penalty. So essentially, if you wanted to, although you wouldn't because national programs are popular, you could show whatever you wanted at any time if it was locally made. So we didn't do that because people like, Masterpiece and other popular shows, but we were able to, we really said, what's out there, what's possible. We wanted to be as broad and inclusive as we could, and we started with a very modest budget. So we do offer some license payment for local and regional films. It's not a lot, it's anywhere from $200 to $3,000 per film, essentially based on length, because that was the easiest way to make it streamlined and
Can you repeat the dollars again, please?
between $200 and $2,000 per film, and we license all manner of lengths. It could be 5 minutes, it could be 2 hours. It really depends on whether it meets the criteria of our series. And what we've done is essentially we've been able to keep it broad by not limiting it just to Vermont films. So we license films from New Hampshire, from Maine, from Western Massachusetts, mostly, and Quebec. So we've kept it regional, which has been helpful because we really wanted to see how many films we could license that had a local or regional flair. And it's called Made Here. So essentially the subject, we are talking about documentary film here. I mean, that's primarily what anyone would be looking for when it comes to PBS. But we called it Made Here because we wanted to keep it as broad as possible. So really it's about where it's made, so we kind of bake that into our promotion. We find a local connection, whether it's the director or producer or some major connection, and we actually promote that as part of the film. So it could be a film about Africa, but it could be made by someone that lives in Middlebury. So that's how we've kept it broad and inclusive, and we're able to show every single week, and we're actually hoping to expand that. And so really, we keep it very simple. There isn't a huge opportunity to fund. We don't have a strand of finances to fund the production of films. It really is more on the distribution side. And we also have a great relationship with other regional PBS stations. As I said, everyone is making decisions at each station about what they choose to show. Not every PBS around the country has a local strand, especially as strong as we do, but we work really well with New Hampshire and Maine, and we often will share films with each other. We've done time premieres in Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine of local films too, which has been interesting. We've also worked with Rhode Island a little bit, and Springfield, Mass, and hopefully we'll work more with GBH as well. I think that's what's great. That's what's great about PBS that really stands out, is that if you're looking for local grassroots distribution, it's a great way to start. We talk to each other, we share things, we get to know what each programmer is interested in and what works for their market, and it's a great way to get distribution and perhaps build towards something for your next film.
Just real quick, 2 follow-ups before we go back to that. One, what is the duration of the license term? And my second one was, is it exclusive or non-exclusive?
Right, those are good questions. So we keep it really open-ended when licensing. We have no restrictions on our end, so if you want to do anything with your film, we welcome you to. Really, our goal is to share your film with our audience, but also to support you in whatever way that we can. So if you want to stream it on your own site or offer it up to another streaming service or another neighboring station, we're not concerned about competition or anything like that. We really want to just make your film available to be seen by an audience. And duration is, again, it's situational. It's different for every filmmaker. We try to keep it as simple as possible, so we try to license over a period of time, an unlimited amount of plays. We do, at this point, hope to get broadcast and streaming rights. It's really important for us because we're trying to reach everyone wherever they watch. So it's really not just about traditional broadcast television. We want to catch those viewers that are watching in different ways. And something that's happening this fall is PBS is launching on YouTube TV as a linear live stream. So that's another way that people are watching. And so for us, it's really important to get licensed on all platforms, but it's really open-ended. It could be for 2 months, it could be for 6 months. Sometimes people license unlimited, so they'll just let us use it whenever we can. We often program premieres, but then rebroadcasts. We have multiple channels, we have digital sub-channels and streaming platforms. So there's a lot of ways. You can't show a film too much these days. It's really impossible because there's so many choices out there. So it's nice for us to have flexibility, and it just makes it a lot easier if we're working with, at this point, we've got a roster of probably over 200 local and regional filmmakers that we're working with. So it just makes it easier for us, quite honestly, because it's not a distributor where we're buying a slate of programming. It's an individual relationship with each filmmaker. So.
Hand that to Beth for a second.
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to talk a little bit about, I feel like I've had some really wonderful experiences with local public television stations, and if there are makers in the audience, I think I've pursued some avenues that are really helpful and interesting to think about. But also, for Made in Boise, for example, once we ended up getting the ITVS funding, we knew that we were in the public television system, and we wanted to be in the public television system. We really started thinking about, well, what is a way that maybe we can work with Idaho Public Television? And the folks at ITVS connected us to the head of programming at Idaho Public Television and also the head of development. Because all these public television stations, they need to fundraise locally in order to exist, and so we wanted to explore with them, would there be local funding resources for us? We're a team based in New York, but making a film in Idaho. And what was really great was that I had done a lot of research into local foundations, philanthropies, corporations that might have philanthropic entities. I had a list, and I had done my research, but then we got on the phone with the programming team and the development team, and it was really great because they said, don't bother approaching this person, this entity, because Boise's a very progressive film in a red state, and they just said, you'd be wasting your time trying to fundraise from those entities. But Idaho Public Television became a real resource for us, and they, really looked at themselves as their way that they could support the film. And what's great is that once Independent Lens chose the film, and now it's the series opener, Idaho Public Television stepped forward and said, let's have a big event around the film in Boise at the local theater. We'll pay for it. So we're having a free screening at the Egyptian Theater in Boise in October for the community in partnership with the local station. So just to think about, for a personal statement, which was a film in New York, I reached out to Steven Segaler, who's the head of news and programming there, and they had an initiative at the time whereby they were doing a series of films about economic inequality. We were able to tap into that and become part of that. And so, I just encourage, if there are filmmakers in the audience, if you want a public television broadcast or think you might have a film for television broadcast, it's great to reach out to your local station. They're looking for local programming, and if you're in a fundraising situation, which you probably are, they can often become very helpful in that capacity.
Okay. Thank you. Just to add a little bit to what Beth just said, I think approaching local stations can be beneficial in another way as well, because some stations can effectively be your ambassador for getting a national broadcast. So not every station does this. There are about 350 stations all over the country of all different sizes, and they're all very different. I mean, they all have a lot in common, but they're very different from each other in what they can do, what they will do, and so on. But there are some stations, including mine, that are very open to having a filmmaker come in the door with a project. And if it seems like the right fit, we sometimes serve as presenting station or as a co-producing station, and we will work with the filmmaker to then take the project to PBS and try to get it on the national system. I mean, there are obviously challenges with that, but that is a role that some stations play. GBH is one of them, way bigger than us. In fact, WTA in Washington, WNAT in New York, and there are others as well. Can I just say one other thing?
Sure.
I think I think if you're a producer and you're standing outside the PBS system and trying to find your way in, it can seem really daunting. And I think collectively we've just sort of been through a whole array of different ways that you can do it. So and we're not done yet. So I think that's both a blessing and a curse. It's a blessing because there are so many ways in. It's a little bit of a curse because it can be so so hard to sort of figure out, what the best way is to get in. I do want to mention one thing that I don't think we've touched on, but that may be relevant to some people, and that is that there are, as I'm sure everyone here knows, there are strands, continuing series on PBS, like Frontline,
Yes.
American Masters,
POV.
Nova, Nature, and those strands are overseen by big stations. A lot of them are at GBH, some of them are in other places. And you can pitch your story directly to those series. So each one of them has an executive producer. They usually have a development head. Although it's hard to get your project taken in, they are always looking for really good projects that fit into that series. So that's yet another way to go.
So I had a follow-up question on that. So are there distinct priorities for each of these programs, and do they shift from season to season? Let's say at POV or Frontline or Independent Lens. How does a filmmaker know what the priorities are so that they can then make the pitch?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. I think the answer is yes. Most of them know what they're looking for, and if you ask them, they will tell you. I think at the same time, they try to be open to things that they haven't thought of. Maybe Beth might have some insights into this as well. But I think, for people who are successful at this, part of what you do is you really work at watching those shows, talking to people who have produced for those shows, trying to go to conferences and talk to the people who commission for those shows, and just learn as much as you can. And sometimes it can be very serendipitous. I've had situations where you're just talking to a commissioner, and you're asking what are you looking for, and they say, well, we need more of X, and you happen to have something in that category, or you think of something on the spot, and you say, well, what about this? So it's a very dynamic sort of process.
Can you define commissioner for a second?
Yeah, a commissioner is someone who can say yes to a project.
I guess it's somebody you want to know.
So I'm a quasi-commissioner because I don't really have a production budget the way, say, Frontline does. But a commissioner is someone who can say yes to a film and generally put some money up for it.
Jared, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I do. So in addition to being a programming director at Vermont PBS, I'm also a pre-screener for the POV series. POV has a completely open-ended submission process, and it's just rolling dates. They have anyone who's made a film can submit their film. And a pre-screener, so there's several folks like me all around the country, and we're really the first wave. So we're watching, because it's open, it's literally anyone can submit a film, and we're watching all of them. And then we make recommendations. And in fact, it's also connected to America Reframed. It's a little bit of a secret here. So if you submit your film to POV and it doesn't end up going up, it could be considered for America Reframed. And I would say that the series that Ron has with World, there's a fantastic series for documentary films that perhaps won't make it to the level of Independent Lens or POV, because you're talking about, 8, 10 slots, maybe a year. The films in POV are typically films that have been shortlisted for the Oscars. It's really, POV is probably the most high profile. So I have some feedback that might help just from the perspective of POV. First of all, be familiar with the series. I think it's really important to watch POV films, watch Independent Lens films, seek out this great series on World like America Reframed and Local USA and many others. And really familiarize yourself with the type of films that are being selected. I think it will be helpful. Based on the hundreds of films that I've seen, it's clear that a lot of people don't know what's actually being selected. Their film just wouldn't qualify for any number of reasons. And I would say in general, the types of films that POV are looking for is what's called point of view. It gives you a little bit of a clue of the type of films. They're obviously high quality films. Films that can have a microcosm of subject. It could be about a person or a thing, but it really has to relate much as broadly as it can to a subject that would be universal. So if you're looking at films that would be, maybe 8 or 10 selections in a season, it has to hit on multiple fronts. It has to be an amazing story, really well produced, and it has to really speak to a universal subject, a subject that's hopefully of interest in the now, what's happening now. So it could be about immigration or adoption or anything, but it has to be some sort of if you think about it, it's a PBS audience, it's a general audience of people, and you have to find something that's going to appeal to them. So I would say that's the first thing to do, is just research. Just watch these series, see what types of films are selected, and I think that's a great way to start.
Take a comment from Ron and Beth, and we'll try to get a couple of concise questions in.
Great, yeah, I actually wanted to pick up on a couple of different things that were just said by both Michael and Eric. One is, to go back to something Michael was talking about, speaking for, I don't work on the national production side of WGBH, I work on its local side, but I obviously have a lot of connections there. My sense from WGBH is that it's fairly unlikely and unusual for a relatively unknown filmmaker to come in with a project that would end up in a national series through GBH. It's pretty rare. There are in-house producers, there are long-established relationships with existing producers, both domestically and internationally. I think if you're someone of, say, Michael's experience, they're more likely to talk to you than somebody who they've never heard of before. Having said that, there are exceptions to every rule. I'm just trying to sort of give you a sense of the reality here. And also, as far as the kinds of things that are being looked for, I think it's a little early to see how this is going to play out with the national productions from the likes of GBH and TBT and WIDA and others. But less than a year ago, a new programmer took over at PBS, and he's developed a plan that he's planned out for 3 years of quarterly themes. That not everything in the national schedule is going to be, hooked into that theme, but they're going to be actively seeking programming that ties into these themes. And so I suspect that as time goes on, we'll see series like Nova and American Experience and others coming out with programs that hook into these themes as well, so they can benefit from that. So it's just something to be aware of. And there was a third thing that was, so Eric mentioned a couple of World Series, and I just wanted to take a minute to talk about those so you were aware of these as a possible outlet. World has a number of series that are original to the channel and that are created either at WGBH or in conjunction with partners. The company called American Documentary Inc., which is the company that makes the POV series for PBS, also collaborates with World on a series called America Reframed. So that's why Eric was saying sometimes things that don't make the cut for the very small number of slots on POV end up on America Reframed because they're worthy of national broadcast. You just can't, you can't air everything. But that series, a couple of points about that. First of all, if you go to worldchannel.org, you can find out more about the channel and our series. But America Reframed is specifically looking at domestic stories, as the title would suggest, and looking for stories that, as my boss on World likes to say, tell stories of difference, whether that's racial, religious, ethnic, abilities, socioeconomic levels, you name it, but essentially stories coming from communities whose stories aren't widely represented on television. That's part of the World Channel's mission overall, and America Reframed is its flagship series, and so that's really the focus of that show. Local USA is another original series that's a half-hour magazine format. It gathers up segments from public television stations and independent producers around the country. Each episode is based around a theme. It could be about veterans coming home. It could be about death and dying. Some of them are lighter than that too. But each episode features multiple segments, occasionally a full half-hour film tied to a particular theme. On the World Channel website, there is a submission button, and it takes you to a portal where you can actually submit films for consideration for both of those series with more information about them. And so if you have something that you think would be appropriate, keeping in mind that Local USA, because it's a magazine, is often looking for short segments, not full-length things. And we also acquire stuff for digital only, or it may start out on digital and end up on broadcast. So length is not really a barrier. If it's something short, you should still consider it. Anyway.
So I think that pitching is a subject all to itself. But I guess I just wanted to encourage that if you are going to approach a public television station or POV or independent lens and its programmers or sort of following what you were saying, not just to watch the series, but what have they done that might relate to your film? If you are making a film about China's one-child policy, you probably should not reach out to an independent lens, for example, because they're showing one-child nation. If you reach out and, the programmers will expect you to know what else that they have done that might be similar. And if you do your research and they've done a lot that is similar, you might not want to pitch them. But I just also really encourage you not actually to hit a submit button, but to really try to reach out and speak to somebody. It's really important to have that personal connection on the other end and to have a person to whom you are pitching or submitting, and that you can actually talk to them about what they're looking for and why, and that you can then frame your submission, your pitch appropriately. So much of a successful pitch is about the framing of it. So I just want to add those two things and follow up to what you were saying.
We probably have time for one or two concise and directed questions. Yes.
Hi. First of all, my name is Adam. I actually got a chance to intern when Eric first started at PBS. And I met Beth at this festival a couple years ago. It's cool to see a couple familiar faces. I'm curious to hear, we've been talking a lot about pitching and bringing films to either the mothership or a local station. But I'm curious to hear about what avenues there are for projects that are really early stages. Something that might just be like an idea on paper or a connection that can give a filmmaker an opportunity to secure that type of distribution or funding that can then allow them to make a film rather than coming with an almost completed project.
Who's jumping on that one, Michael?
Well, I mean, thank you. Most of the things that I work on are exactly that. We either come up with an idea or producers come to us with an idea. The only thing that exists is, a piece of paper. We will work with a producer to help them, create a pitch that we think will be effective. And then, we will take that, to pitch to PBS. I mean, I will say that, we think really hard about what projects we'll take on, just because there are so many factors that can influence, its chances for success. And one of them, sadly enough, is this fundable? Is there, just acknowledging that you're unlikely to get the entire budget from PBS, is there a path of funding? Is there a path to funding? Can we at least imagine what that path would look like? But I think people come to PBS and to public media generally with things at every conceivable stage. It can be an idea, it can be a film that's partially funded, it can be a film that's been shot, but the producer's still trying to raise the rest of the money to edit, and everything in between.
Michael, just to follow up on that, this is at Twin Cities Public Television. Are there other entities that are as open to this kind of early stage pitch than TPT? Do you know others that would be?
Oh, sure.
Can you name a few?
Well, I think you guys can help me out with this, but I think the major producing stations are GBH, which is really the biggest, WNET, WETA. They're really sort of generally considered the top tier.
Yeah.
And they're equally open to this.
Yeah, it depends on. There's no single person usually at those bigger stations. It depends on who you're talking to, and it really depends on what they have in the pipeline and what their needs are and that sort of thing.
Yeah. Go ahead, Beth.
I just don't think you can underestimate how difficult it is to get a project across when it's in just an idea stage. You don't have a sample reel. I don't think it should be oversold that it's easy. It's incredibly difficult, even for the most experienced producers. I mean, typically you do have to have a sample. You have to have a really strong, developed treatment or proposal idea, treatment or proposal, sorry. I think that if you have extraordinary access to a particular story or community, and it is a community, for example, whose story needs to be told, I think that that is very much in your favor, but it is really, I mean, there are funds, there are independent funds that support films at the idea stage. There's like Catapult Film Fund is one. ITVS now does have a development film fund. IDA has their enterprise documentary fund. The deadline is on September 2nd. You don't have to have a reel. But it is quite difficult, and I just wouldn't want to underestimate it. And a lot of filmmakers find that's the challenge many times, especially for young filmmakers. How do you get from the idea stage to even having a pitch reel? It's really, that's part of it. That is a challenge within the industry, and it's kind of a structural reality in some ways.
Yeah, I think even you said it's like chicken or the egg. It's like, how do you get funding without distribution, and how do you get distribution without funding? And those
Or in some cases, how do you get funding without funding? Because, I don't, as I said earlier, I don't work on the national production side of GBH, but because of GBH's reputation, we get a lot of queries from filmmakers. And I think there's a perception out there that because we're big and we do a lot of work, we must be rolling in it. And that is actually not true, because so much of our money is already spoken for by productions that we've got underway. So taking on something new is not always a huge priority. But I have been told by people on our production side that if somebody has an idea, they're probably not even going to get a meeting to discuss that idea unless they've come with some possibility of funding, some funder that they, you may not have them all sewn up, but at least there's a good chance that they could get funding for that project before somebody would even talk to them at GBH. So,
Okay, why don't we take one more question, and we'll try to stay close to our time at 5 o'clock if there are other things going on. I have one right here.
Sure, okay. So I just want very concrete answer. So if I was going to meet you at the cocktail party, and then you said, I gave you my card, and I call you up, and then I say, okay, I'm ready to present I'm a script writer, so like, okay, what do you want to see from me? A treatment, like 300, 500 word treatment, and a sizzle reel, and like what?
I mean, for me, for me, and I think other folks are different, but for me, it's really all about the idea.
Okay.
So I've gone down the road with people based on a compelling verbal pitch. I'm fine getting an email with 3 paragraphs that concisely tell me what the idea is. I don't need a treatment at that stage. I certainly don't need a pitch reel.
You need a budget.
I don't need no, I mean, I think an idea of what the ballpark is. Now, if you have a more detailed treatment, if you have a budget, that's great. But I'm open to early stage ideas. Now, maybe that's not that typical, but I think there are other people who are like that. But the other thing, just to some of the points that you guys made, is I would also want to know a little bit about you and your background, because films are costly, and a lot of effort goes into getting them off the ground. Sometimes literally, years, so people want to have confidence that the producer they're dealing with has the ability or the track record to produce something like that. So that I think that's also right up there with the quality of the idea.
So we're going to wrap up. This is something where Beth would say to me, well, we could go on for this for another hour, or we should have done 3 hours. We don't have that, but I think what we have on this panel is just a depth of experience and a level of articulation that actually, I think, answered a lot of questions that perhaps you had. They may be available afterwards to talk to them. And in closing, I do want to say is a congratulations to Beth. She touched on it, but just to make a big deal out of it, Made in Boise, which screened here this morning, will lead off the 18th season of Independent Lens on Monday, October 28th. So if you didn't go this morning and you missed that, I'm sure you get PBS as part of your highly expensive cable service. So please check out her film. We'll probably have multiple exposures. Just a little bit of housekeeping. We have a happy hour going on right now out on the patio in between the buildings here. We'll break at 6 o'clock for dinner, etc. And then we'll be back up at 7:15 with our evening films. We have a party tonight. If you are a pass holder, festival, filmmaker, or whatever, we'll be at American Flatbread at about 9:30. And entertaining us tonight as part of the party of national recording artists Maya Sharp and Anna Schulze, who have put together a duo called Roscoe and Etta, which is named after their guitars. And there will be flatbread. So anyway, thank you very much for coming to this panel. Let's give these folks a round of applause.